Is the sound all right? Okay. No? This darn thing. What?
He said he was going to give Parliament the right to a free vote. And then he explained what he meant by a free vote.
You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters.
Mr. Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation,
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tony Blair and Mr. Christopher Hitchens.
Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the Red Ensign Live, a dream worth living for. This episode, I'd like to begin this episode with a short exchange from the dialectic on Twitter. And the purpose of raising this exchange is twofold. First of all, let's describe this. A so-called conservative activist named Grove, who is well, I mean, he has in his bio, he's pictured with Pierre Poilievre. You know, he obviously has some ins in the Conservative Party of Canada. But he's an ideological conservative in a kind of strange sense. And one of the things that's very strange about ideological one of the things that's very strange about this kind of class of conservative activist is that they're completely unaware that Canada and the Anglosphere more broadly have a distinctive legal and political tradition. And so they're constantly making assertions on the basis of appeals to the legal system of the American Empire. Right, particularly the U.S. domestic legal system, and so we got into it a little bit over the issue of whether or not visas can be revoked, and I pointed out eventually comes down to a visa cannot be revoked because it's a contract. Putting aside his obvious kind of preference for his own people, which is kind of buried in behind this, he raises this really kind of fundamental position that is a legal contract sits above the sovereign. Now, anybody who's at all familiar with Canadian history knows that whether you're a trucker in 2023, whether you're a Quebec nationalist in the 70s, whether you're an objector to conscription during the Second World War, whether you're an objector to conscription during the First World War, or whether you're a Red River colonist, Canada has a very clear structure of sovereignty, and a combination of the King and Parliament, and today really just Parliament, the Prime Minister's office specifically, holds absolute sovereignty in the country. It makes the exception, and there is no court which can hold it to account. There is no sense in which the Prime Minister or the government are accountable to the court in Canada. Canada does not have judicial supremacy, nor does international law have any mechanism to enforce its norms or decisions on Canada or any history of successfully doing so. And so the minute you hear the word, the government cannot do X, Y, Z in Canada, you should immediately ascertain why the government cannot do X, Y, Z. And if the answer is because it's against the law, you know instantly that the person that you're interacting with has no history or context for Canadian legal tradition or Canada's history. I say this by way of introduction to discuss the broader topic of Canadian nationalism. Now, this exchange came in the midst of a broader dialectic going on the Canadian right about the position of Canadian nationalism in the context of a political climate in which anti-migration is very popular. Now, there's a lot to say about Canadian nationalism. It has a complicated history. It begins in the early 20th century under the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King. It begins seriously under the government of William Lyon Mackenzie King after the First World War, and exists in dialectic against the Anglo and French Canadian identities that formed the country previously. And particularly in the post-war period, figures like Lester B. Pearson and John Diefenbaker articulated the argument that Canada was or should be a nation, right? Rudyard Kipling was another very famous figure from the Anglosphere in that period, who attempted to articulate a Canadian identity which both treasured its ethnic disparity but had a distinct national identity that encompassed both people groups. It's a kind of interesting thing. But that post-World War I project failed. In the period after the war, well, by the 70s, it was very obvious that the ethnic identities of Canadians divided regionally were radically more salient than any Canadian identity. And this crisis was obvious even to Canada's ruling class, who would have greatly preferred not to acknowledge it. And so in 1977, they held a conference called the Options Conference on the grounds of the University of Toronto. Everyone who was anyone in Canadian business or particularly Canadian intellectuals was there, and they discussed the matter. I want to play some clips from it. I think you'll find the dialogue very recognizable. So this is what people were talking about in 1977 regarding Canadian nationalism. That's 50 years ago.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to extend to all of you a very warm welcome on behalf of the University of Toronto to the Options Conference. This conference had its origins in the event of November the 15th, 1976. The election of the Parti Québécois, with its stated purpose of independence for Quebec, precipitated a searching reconsideration by all Canadians of the nature of our federation and of the changes that may be needed to preserve and to strengthen national purpose. Recently, Keith Spicer commented on the search by Canadians for a national dream, noting that we haven't even had a good nightmare yet. Perhaps we're embarking on a series of nightmares in Canada unless we can come to grips effectively with the long-standing problems of the founding peoples and a multicultural society, the nature of our national symbols and structures, the balance of power between federal and provincial jurisdictions in a federal system, and our fundamental economic problems, including the special question of regional economic opportunity and regional disparity.
So those are the questions that the Canadian intellectuals of 1977 were grappling with on behalf of the Laurentian elite, looking for a new political formula after acknowledging the failure of Canadian nationalism as a political formula for governing the country. I want to go through some of the comments made at that conference by various Canadian intellectuals of the era, beginning with Northrop Frye.
But even then, it never shook off its role as an American satellite sufficiently to be taken very seriously by the rest of the world as a distinctive political presence. Arthur Lauer's book, Colony to Nation, marks the optimistic beginning of this period. George Grant's lament for a nation, the pessimistic end of it.
I want people to see that the idea that Canada was to be a nation state that was to undergo an ethnogenesis and become a nation, a political representation of a single people embodied in the national government, operating on its behalf, was strangled in the crib, right? You see the dream in the Laurentian elite, particularly through the period of the war. When I wrote about Canada's experience in the First World War for the Remembrance Day series, I placed a significant emphasis on the aspirations of the Canadian political class to create a separate Canadian army. And there are a number of contextual reasons for it, but one of the really important things to understand is its importance from the point of view of propaganda in Canadian domestic politics, right? The Canadian elite at the time were trying to convince Canadians that they were one people, particularly convince French and English Canadians that they were one people, because to do so, frankly, advanced the power of the Laurentian elite against their enemies in the imperial elite, who would have preferred that Canada was a collection of an organization of colonies within the British Empire, right? One of these visions died, one of these visions survived, but the vision that survived died after the war because it wasn't true, right? There was no ethnogenesis between French and English Canadians. They have a great deal in common, but there was a political organization between French and English Canadians. It's a very different thing. And the consequences of that difference ripple through Canadian history. And we now, in this moment, struggle with the reality that both the French Canadian and Anglo Canadian identities are individually vastly more salient than a Canadian identity, but that the two peoples have much more in common than we do with any of the post-1980 migrants who, well, let's just put it this way, they have a different experience. I want to roll a few more clips from the Options Conference to give you a flavor for the way the intellectuals of this period were dealing with this issue.
How, for instance, does one reconcile a sense of identity, which undoubtedly exists in Quebec, with a sense of Canadian identity and common allegiance to Canada, which is likewise a reality?
All right, we're going to keep going here. We're going to move to Ramsey Cook.
Those of you who have examined the white paper on language, which the government of Quebec issued last April, will have seen that the major underlying assumption, an assumption which later was stated fairly clearly in the first clause of Bill 1, of the original Bill number 1, the major assumption was a conception of the nation as a predetermined, culturally homogeneous community. Moreover, I think that the platform of the Parti Québécois and the proposal for a referendum assumes this same principle when it speaks of the right of national self-determination for nations defined in a cultural sense.
All right, so what they're getting at here is that Quebec nationalists, today the Québécois elite, and for that matter, the Six Nations Iroquois sub-elite, a comparably small and fairly insignificant group within the country, used the language of the political formula of Canadian nationalism in order to establish their legitimacy, their right to sovereignty over their own subgroups. Right. So the minute you put forward nationalism in Canada as a legitimate governing formula, you immediately see subgroups within Canadian territory leverage the same language to articulate their legitimate, well, in their view, legitimate grievances, their legitimate right to govern their own nations within Canada. Right? It's a self-decaying political formula, which is why the government of Canada in the 70s abandoned it. All right? The reason for the post-national state is not a hatred for heritage Canadians. The reason for the post-national state is that the Laurentian elite of the time foresaw that their power would be broken as a consequence of the use of this political narrative, right? Because the political narrative they used to justify Canada also justified a more salient set of political communities that existed subnationally. And so the concept of multiculturalism, even the early project of mass migration by Pierre Trudeau the Elder, was executed explicitly in order to deal with this problem, in order to cement the power of the ruling class of that time. I want to grab a couple of more headlines here.
For, of course, this post-national trend is a worldwide one, and if Canada works out its present crisis successfully, it could serve as a pilot project for an emerging new mode of human life.
All right, the post-national state was alive and well in 1977 at the Options Conference. It is not an invention of Justin Trudeau in the 2010s. All right. And its relationship to the international drive towards the post-national state is very old as well. It goes back maybe even to Pearson at the end of his life. There's layers of importance to this. The first thing to note is that it wasn't a random decision that the ruling elite of Canada abandoned nationalism as a political formula. There were internal reasons within Canada that drove that decision, and there were external reasons without Canada that drove that decision. Those internal reasons are more salient today than they were in 1977, vastly more salient today. And those external reasons are at least as salient today as they were in 1977. So if your dream is a Canadian nationalist government operating on behalf of a single community that's undergone an ethnogenesis within the political entity now understood as Canada, you're going to have to overcome these profound forces, both internally and externally, in order to have any future for that dream. I want to roll a last piece to this before we move on from the Options Conference.
I'm talking about an economic crisis, and I'm certainly not an economist or even an alarmist, and I think they're pretty well both in the same category. But I notice, I can read the Globe and Mail report on business, I see the dollar slipping down, friends talking about opening bank accounts in the States.
And here we have the other elephant in the room. The Canadian elite have deeply entrenched economic ties to the United States, ties that will not be defeated by populist sentiment. Okay? No amount of elbows up is going to change that fundamental relationship. And so, unless those underlying dynamics change, nationalism on the basis of a very weak ethnic identity with much more salient underlying ethnic identities is like it was a bad go of it in 1977. The Laurentian elite were probably right to give up on it. It's a way worse proposition today. And so whatever your view about the current political formula and its problems, you have to reckon with the reason why the current political formula was adopted and the problems with simply returning to a previous iteration of the political formula, right? if you're if you pick up anti-migration and say this is justification for Canadian nationalism, we're going to have strong government on behalf of the Canadian people as an ethnic construct, you're going to have all these same problems all over again. They're going to be worse because there's been a lot of demographic transformation in the country. And not only that, you're going to have the international context that is probably even more difficult for Canada today than it was in 1977. The international economic context, the elite context within the country, where every set of elites except the French Canadian elite have probably more assets outside the country than inside the country, right? And so when you think about political formulas going forward, these are all problems that need to be on your mind and need to be seriously addressed in constructing a future for our people. Now, I want to take a minute and put a pin in that and point out that as much as there are problems with the nationalist political formula, there are problems which are every bit as difficult for the post-nationalist political formula. I put together a mini thread this week on Twitter, which everybody thought was inspired by a recent article about what the poverty line is in the United States. It had nothing. I was completely unaware of that article until after I'd posted this, and unaware of the discourse that had kind of emerged around this. I had actually been doing some podcast necromancy and listening to episodes of the Jay Burden show from years ago. And what I gleaned from this necromancy is something that I have strongly suspected all the way along in the line. That is that the strongest single political current in MAGA is the desire by kind of white middle America to have their wages go up, right? There's whether it's Zoomers or whether it's left behind Rust Belt workers or whether it's other parts of the coalition, the actual core complaint more than any other thing is something like, we can't form families, we can't build a future for ourselves because we don't have enough money, and we don't have enough money because we have to compete globally for wages. Now, I have a certain kind of sympathy for this perspective at one level. I don't think that it is. Look, they're correct that the elite that rule over them have systematically undermined their purchasing power and forced them to compete globally for wages in order to enrich themselves at the expense of, the part of the country that the mega coalition comes from. So they're not incorrect. They're also not incorrect to point out that the drive to increase asset prices, home prices are kind of the stereotypical one, but this is true of all large capital assets, which have been driven up in price in order to support the lifestyles of the old at the expense of the young. They're not incorrect to point out that this is a zero-sum game and they're getting screwed. What they're wrong about is that this process can be reversed. So if you attempt to reverse this process, it will result in the collapse of the American empire, and they're going to be much poorer than they are today, even if they're relatively richer compared to other people in their society. But they're also wrong about the fact that their problem, their inability to form a family or to forge a future for themselves, is because of economic privation. And the reason I know that they're wrong about this is because there have been Americans who have been forming futures in economic circumstances and material circumstances that are radically more difficult. They've been having large families in economic circumstances that are radically more difficult than modern Americans for maybe 250-year period of American history in Canada since from the settlement of the Quebec colony through till 1900. Almost every person went through economic circumstances more difficult than our economic circumstances today, and yet they formed families, and yet they had many children, and yet they believed in their future, and yet they considered themselves blessed to live that way. All right. The poverty of the citizens of the modern American empire is a spiritual poverty. It is not a material poverty. And it's a spiritual poverty because they've been denied the one essential thing that these people had that drove them to fight through the most difficult material circumstances imaginable. And that is an identity, a sense of who they were as a people, a sense of who they were with respect to the God that they worshipped, and a sense of who they were that explained what the sacrifice was all for, right? So as much as I can point out the reasons for the political formula of the post-national state, the political formula of the multinational state, the binational state from the 19th century, had this profound strength to it because it met the meaning needs of the people who were living in that society. And the post-national state does not meet the meaning needs of the people living in our society. So that even if we're materially much richer than the people who lived in Canada in the 19th century, we're unable to live fruitfully and unable to justify our existence into the future to the point that we're, committing suicide by refusing to build a future for ourselves, either in terms of reproduction or even in terms of material investment in the country. Our elites don't see any problem with investing, with having the majority of their assets outside of the country, having alternate visas and all of this, because the story they tell themselves doesn't commit them to the country at all, and doesn't give them a reason why this vision of themselves is immoral. And so you have these two sets of completely intractable problems that face Canada today, and they have to be addressed. They have to be addressed with a new political formula, a new story that we tell ourselves as a people about who we are, about why we're here, about what future we're going to have for ourselves, about the God that we glorify, about the accomplishments of our ancestors, what they were and what they mean. Most fundamentally, about why we should sacrifice in order to build a future for generations to come. Without a story that we mutually agree on in this regard, we will have no future as a people, right? The people coming to dispossess us of our land and of the riches that we have all have this in common. You can go to Brampton and you can ask for a story about who they are and about what they're doing, and they have an answer, right? That's why they're a political threat. And so as I don't have an answer for how to rearticulate the story that we tell ourselves, the story of our people going into the future, except to say that we have to have an answer, and that answer cannot be intimately tied up with the Canadian state. Because if it's intimately tied up with the Canadian state, then all of the incentive structures that we discussed that killed the project of Canadian nationalism to begin with are all going to operate. And all of the incentive structures associated with the American empire that seek to undermine local nationalism outside of conflict zones are going to operate, and they're going to kill that story, right? And so, as we discuss on this channel, the development of elites to service the various peoples of Canada, and to do so well in the context of the kind of late American empire, this all ought to be on our mind. Okay, I think that's enough on the for the opening lecture. There are a couple of questions that came in for the live show that I wanted to address, and so I'll go through and have a look at them. Okay, first question: thoughts on simply picking the winning team and joining the LPC? So I don't think that there is much productive about electoral politics between the Liberal Party of Canada, the Conservative Party of Canada, the NDP, or any of the other joke parties. I don't think that there's an important political choice there to be made, except a prudential choice for how to minimize the damage that the current administration is going to do to the country. When we get to an election, I'll talk a little bit more about the specific dialectic, just like I did going into the last election. But it's not as though there's a representative of our people that exists in formal politics in this country. And so I don't think you should be committed to a particular party at this stage. I include the People's Party in that. I don't think you should be emotionally committed or financially committed to a political party right at this moment. The next question here, talk about the difference between real life Americans and okay, so I made some comments on Twitter contrasting my experience with Americans in real life and my experience with Americans online. And I should preface this by saying that my experience with Americans in real life is not of a representative sample of the country. It's the places that I've done business and worked in my lifetime. Very concentrated on the East Coast. And that's going to create some biases. But one of the things that I will note is that because of the pathway from the military into the professional managerial class, I've noticed that there's a much greater degree of self-awareness and the awareness of the American place in history, the awareness of the global footprint that the United States occupies among Americans that I have met in real life than there is among Americans that I've spoken with online. And I will say that the fact that these people know almost nothing about the countries that the American empire occupies does not prevent them from understanding that they're kind of a global superpower in their they've gone and deployed somewhere, often to some hole in the wall that they otherwise never would have experienced. And one of the consequences of that is they kind of understand the global scope of the American project in a way that you often don't see represented in online commentary. And if you get people outside of the public arena, which is Twitter, YouTube, etc., immediately they're doing a lot less signaling, and they're a lot more able to self-reflect. And so I think it's important, as we discuss our American and friends, to realize that what you see online is a public performance, and it's a public performance of the kind of men who are tilted towards the online world. It's not a balanced picture of America. So I think that's worth kind of grabbing. What steps do you think the Laurentian elite will take to reinvigorate themselves? So I think the most important thing that the Laurentian elite are doing right now is attempting to break up migrant groups as a political threat to their power. So if you look at what's going on with the Carney changes to migration programs of various kinds, not only is the project increasing the popularity of the Laurentian elite as a ruling class, but it is totally disrupting the power projects of the various diaspora groups in Canada. Is very unpopular with diaspora groups, both in the LPC and the CPC, as you saw in the interaction I cataloged off the top of the show. They're very upset about it. But that's an essential part of what's going on. The problem the Laurentian elite have more than any other problem is this inability to transmit from generation to generation a story about who they are and why they should rule. That's why Justin Trudeau, a younger member of the Laurentian elite, is a clown, and Mark Carney, 20 years his senior, carries himself with radically more seriousness, right? And that, it's true that these are just two members of an elite class, but they're representative of the generational difference between these two groups. For all that you might rightly negatively say about boomer libs in Canada, they are serious people to a degree that their children just aren't. And that's a stretch, because older Canadian liberals are not especially serious, but their children are just absolute jokes. I don't know how the Laurentian elite are ever going to solve that problem. I suspect that they will not solve that problem, and they will cease their position as the dominant elite class of this country as a consequence of the transition past Generation X. I just don't think that they can continue as an elite class. I don't think there's enough talent there. And I think that the power in the country will be redistributed as a consequence. Combine that with the imperial crisis going on in America, and I just don't think they stand a chance. So that's my view on that question. Do I like hockey? I grew up watching hockey. I grew up, I played a little bit as a young person. It's part of who we are. I don't particularly love it, but it's part of us. Like many other things that are Canadian that I could take or leave, but it's part of us. I'm not really a hunter, but hunting is so deep in the bones of Canadian masculine culture. It should in some sense be a requirement for Canadian men to pass into adulthood to partake in the ritual. And I feel the same way about hockey. There are things about it that I like. I really can't stand the way the NHL is run right at the moment, has been run for the last 20 years. But there's something deeply Canadian about it. The second part of the question is, do I have a team? And the answer to that is, I have no interest in professional hockey any longer. Not even like Olympic hockey. I can't. During the pandemic, I made a decision to completely disengage from all professional sports, to take my attention away from it. I did so at the time because I was short on time and attention. But I think it was a correct decision, and it's a correct decision. And it's a decision I'm quite happy about. All right, I'm running out of time. My time constraints for my real life are catching up to me here, so I won't be able to get to all the questions in the chat. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you have a productive couple of weeks.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations. by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.